Imagine the year is 480 BC, and the most massive invasion force in human history is bearing down on a tiny group of warriors standing in a narrow mountain pass. Behind them lies everything they hold dear: their families, their freedom, their entire way of life. Ahead of them stretches an endless sea of enemy soldiers, so numerous that their arrows literally darken the sky. These defenders know they're going to die. They know reinforcements aren't coming, and yet they plant their feet, raise their shields, and prepare to write one of the most legendary chapters in military history. This is the story of how 300 Spartans and their allies held the line against impossible odds and changed the fate of Western civilization forever. Before we dive into this incredible tale of sacrifice and heroism, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss our deep dives into history's most epic moments. Now, let's journey back to ancient Greece and witness the ultimate last stand. The Battle of Thermopylae isn't just another ancient conflict buried in dusty history books. It's a story that has echoed through 25 centuries, inspiring countless generations with its raw demonstration of courage against overwhelming odds. But the real story goes far deeper than the Hollywood version you might know. This wasn't just about 300 warriors making a heroic last stand. This was about the collision of two completely different worlds: the rising tide of Persian imperialism against the fierce independence of Greek city-states. It was about a strategic gamble that would either save or doom the birthplace of democracy. And most importantly, it was about ordinary men who chose to do something extraordinary when everything they valued hung in the balance. To truly understand what happened at those narrow gates between the mountains and the sea, we need to step back and see the bigger picture. We need to understand the forces that brought these armies together, the men who led them, and why this particular battle became the stuff of legend. This is more than just a war story. It's the tale of how a small group of determined people can alter the course of history itself. Our story begins not at Thermopylae, but on the plains of Marathon, 10 years earlier in 490 BC. King Darius of Persia had launched the first major invasion of Greece, confident that his vast empire would easily crush these quarrelling city-states. Instead, he witnessed one of the most shocking military upsets in ancient history. A much smaller Athenian force fighting for their homeland completely routed his army. Persian soldiers fled in panic back to their ships, leaving behind their weapons and their pride. For Darius, this wasn't just a military defeat. It was a humiliation that shook the very foundations of Persian imperial prestige. How could the greatest empire the world had ever known be embarrassed by a collection of Greek farmers and merchants? The defeat at Marathon became an obsession that would consume him until his death. But when Darius died, that burning desire for revenge passed to his son, a man who would make his father's ambitions look modest by comparison. Xerxes wasn't content to simply avenge his father's defeat. Where Darius had seen a punitive expedition, Xerxes envisioned total conquest. He believed himself to be divinely appointed, a living god whose destiny was to rule the entire known world. Greece wasn't just going to be punished, it was going to be absorbed completely into his ever-expanding empire. For 4 long years, Xerxes assembled what ancient sources describe as the largest military force ever gathered. From every corner of his massive domain, stretching from India to Egypt, from the steppes of Central Asia to the shores of the Black Sea, he called up soldiers. Modern historians debate the exact numbers, but even conservative estimates suggest a land army of somewhere between 70,000 and 300,000 troops supported by over 1,200 warships. The logistical challenges of moving such a force were staggering, but Xerxes attacked them with the unlimited resources of his empire. He ordered a canal dug through the Athos Peninsula to give his fleet a safer passage. Even more audaciously, he commanded the construction of a bridge of ships across the Hellespont Strait, essentially building a temporary bridge over a mile long that would allow his army to march from Asia directly into Europe. When storms destroyed the first bridge, Xerxes' reaction revealed everything about his character and mindset. He ordered the sea itself to be whipped 300 times and had the engineers responsible for the failed bridge executed. This wasn't the rational response of a military commander dealing with a setback. This was the rage of a man who truly believed he was divine and that nature itself should bend to his will. The second bridge held, and in 480 BC, this incredible procession began crossing from Asia into Europe. Ancient sources describe the crossing taking 7 days and 7 nights, with soldiers, cavalry, supply trains, and camp followers streaming across in an endless parade of imperial might. While Xerxes was assembling his invasion force, the Greeks faced a terrifying reality. Most of the northern city-states, seeing the hopelessness of resistance, had already submitted to Persian authority. The scattered Greek cities faced a choice that would define their future: surrender their independence or unite in desperate defense of their freedom. In this moment of crisis, leadership naturally fell to the one Greek state that everyone acknowledged as the supreme military power, Sparta. But Sparta wasn't just another city-state with a good army. It was something unique in the ancient world, a society that had transformed itself into a living weapon. Where other Greek cities pursued trade, philosophy, art, and politics, Sparta had focused on a single deadly craft: the production of the world's most effective soldiers. Their entire social system, known as the Agoge, was designed around this singular purpose. It was a machine for creating warriors, and it was unlike anything else in the ancient world. The Spartan way of life began before birth. When a child was born, elders would examine the infant, and any baby deemed weak or imperfect would be abandoned on the hillsides to die. This brutal practice ensured that only the strongest would survive to continue the Spartan line. For those who passed this first test, life was regimented from childhood. At age 7, boys were removed from their families and entered the Agoge, a state-controlled training program that would dominate the next decade of their lives. They learned basic literacy, but the real curriculum focused on survival, physical conditioning, and military skills. They lived in communal barracks and were deliberately kept hungry to teach them resourcefulness. They were expected to steal food, but if caught, they were punished severely, not for the theft itself, but for being careless enough to get caught. The training was designed to strip away individual weakness and forge men who would follow orders without question and endure any hardship without complaint. They learned to function as part of a unit, to trust their fellow soldiers completely, and to view death in battle as preferable to retreat or surrender. Spartan society reinforced these military values at every level. Courage wasn't just admired, it was the highest virtue. Cowardice wasn't just discouraged, it was met with complete social ostracism. A Spartan who fled from battle would be shunned by his family, friends, and community. The shame was considered worse than death itself. Even Spartan women played a crucial role in this warrior culture. Unlike women in other Greek cities, Spartan women were educated and physically trained. Their primary duty was understood to be raising strong sons for the state. The famous Spartan saying has mothers telling their sons to return from battle with your shield or on it, meaning come back victorious or die in the attempt, because a fleeing soldier would have had to abandon his heavy shield. This was the system that produced King Leonidas and his 300 royal bodyguards, men who'd been shaped by this harsh crucible and who embodied everything Spartan society valued most. As Xerxes' massive army moved south through Greece, the Greek alliance faced a seemingly impossible strategic problem. How do you stop a force that outnumbers you by tens or hundreds to one? The answer came from Themistocles, the brilliant Athenian general who had masterminded the victory at Marathon. Themistocles proposed a coordinated land and sea operation that would use geography to neutralize the Persian advantage in numbers. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Force the Persians to attack through a narrow pass where their superior numbers would be meaningless, while simultaneously blocking their navy in a narrow strait where it couldn't maneuver effectively. The location chosen for the land battle was a narrow coastal pass in central Greece called Thermopylae, literally the hot gates in Greek, named for the sulfur springs that bubbled up from the ground. In 480 BC, this pass was extraordinarily narrow, squeezed between steep mountains on one side and the sea on the other. At its narrowest point, it was perhaps only 100 meters wide, barely enough space for a few dozen men to stand shoulder to shoulder. The strategic brilliance of this choice cannot be overstated. The narrow confines of Thermopylae would act as a force multiplier for the Greeks, completely negating the Persian numerical advantage. No matter how many soldiers Xerxes brought, he could only fit a small number through the pass at any given time. The Greeks, fighting in their traditional phalanx formation, would be able to meet the Persian attacks on essentially equal terms. Moreover, the position would force the Persians into exactly the kind of fight where Greek advantages in training, equipment, and tactical discipline would be most pronounced. The Persians would have to attack uphill through a narrow gap against a prepared defensive position held by the most elite infantry in the world. But there was a problem that threatened to derail the entire plan. The Persian invasion was occurring during two of the most sacred periods in the Greek religious calendar, the Olympic Games and Sparta's own Carneia festival. Spartan law absolutely forbade military action during the Carneia. It was considered a sacred obligation that superseded even threats to the state. Faced with this impossible choice between religious duty and national survival, the Spartan council crafted a compromise that revealed both their legalistic mindset and their desperate situation. They couldn't send the full army, but they would allow King Leonidas to march north immediately with his personal bodyguard of 300 men. These weren't randomly chosen soldiers, they were the elite of the elite, veteran warriors handpicked by Leonidas himself from among the royal guard. Herodotus adds a chilling detail that suggests everyone understood the likely outcome. Leonidas specifically chose men who already had sons, ensuring that their family lines would continue even if they didn't return. The story is about to take an incredible turn, but before we continue, I want to hear from you. What do you think you would have done in Leonidas' position? Would you have retreated to fight another day, or made the same choice he did? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if you're enjoying this deep dive into one of history's most legendary battles. Before leaving Sparta, Leonidas made a pilgrimage that would become part of the legend itself. He travelled to Delphi to consult the oracle, the most revered spiritual authority in all of Greece. The prophecy he received was both terrifying and ambiguous, delivered in the cryptic style that made the oracle famous throughout the ancient world. The oracle spoke of two possible futures. Either Sparta itself would be destroyed by the invaders, or a Spartan king of royal blood would have to die to save the city. For a man raised in Spartan culture, where duty to the state superseded all personal considerations, this wasn't really a choice at all. Leonidas understood that his death might be the price of his people's survival, and he accepted that burden without hesitation. As Leonidas marched north, he gathered additional allies along the way. By the time the Greek force reached Thermopylae, it numbered around 7,000 men, still a tiny army by ancient standards, but respectable for what was essentially a delaying action. The force included Spartans, Thespians, Thebans, and soldiers from several other Greek cities. Upon reaching the pass, the Greeks immediately began preparing their defensive position. They rebuilt and reinforced an ancient wall known as the Phocian Wall, which blocked the narrowest part of the pass. Behind this wall, they positioned their men in the formation that had made Greek infantry feared throughout the Mediterranean world. To understand what happened next, you need to understand the Greek phalanx formation and why it was so devastatingly effective. A Greek hoplite warrior was essentially a walking fortress. He wore bronze armour covering his chest and legs, topped by the distinctive Corinthian helmet that covered his entire head. His primary weapon was a long spear called a doru, and for close combat he carried a short sword. But the most important piece of equipment was the hoplon, a large round shield made of wood and bronze that protected him from neck to knee. When hoplites formed up for battle, they stood shoulder to shoulder, overlapping their shields to create what was essentially a mobile bronze wall. The front ranks pointed their long spears forward, creating a deadly forest of spear points that could stop any charge. In the narrow confines of Thermopylae, this formation would be nearly unbreakable. The Persians would be forced to attack head-on against prepared positions, and their superior numbers would be meaningless in the restricted space. When the Persian army finally arrived at Thermopylae, it must have been a terrifying sight. Ancient sources describe a force so large it seemed to stretch to the horizon, with banners and weapons glittering in the sun. Xerxes established his command post on a nearby hill where he could watch the battle unfold, confident that the mere sight of his army would send the Greeks fleeing. For 4 days nothing happened. Xerxes waited, genuinely unable to believe that this tiny force would actually dare to defy him. He sent messengers demanding surrender, and according to ancient sources received some of the most famous replies in military history. When told that the Persians had so many archers their arrows would blot out the sun, a Spartan warrior supposedly replied, "Good, then we'll fight in the shade." The Greeks used this time to make their final preparations. They exercised, maintained their equipment, and performed the traditional pre-battle rituals of their culture. Spartan warriors combed their long hair, a custom they followed before battles they expected might be their last. Finally, Xerxes' patience snapped. On the 5th day, he ordered the attack to begin. The battle opened not with a charge, but with a massive barrage of arrows. The Persian archers were among the finest in the world, and when thousands of them fired simultaneously, the effect was as the Greeks had been warned. The sky darkened with arrows, but the Greeks were prepared. They simply raised their heavy bronze shields, creating an overlapping shell that deflected the arrow storm with contemptuous ease. When the barrage ended, the Greek line was still intact, waiting calmly for the real fight to begin. Frustrated by the failure of his archers, Xerxes sent in his first wave of infantry, 10,000 Medes and Sagae, with orders to capture the Greeks alive and bring them before the king. What followed was a masterclass in military tactics and a demonstration of what superior training and equipment could accomplish. The Persian infantry charged forward with tremendous courage, but they were doomed from the moment they entered the pass. Their weapons were designed for the open battlefields of Asia, shorter spears and lighter shields suitable for mobile warfare. Against the Greek phalanx, these weapons were completely inadequate. The Persians found themselves running into what was essentially a meat grinder. Their shorter spears couldn't reach the Greeks, while Greek spears easily found their targets. Their wicker and leather shields shattered against Greek bronze, while Persian weapons couldn't penetrate Greek armour. As men in the front ranks fell, they were trampled by the ranks behind them, creating chaos and panic. The Greeks, meanwhile, fought with mechanical precision. They had trained for years in these exact formations, and the narrow confines of the pass played perfectly to their strengths. They fought in relays, with fresh men rotating to the front as others became tired, maintaining constant pressure on their increasingly demoralized enemies. By the end of the first day, thousands of Persian soldiers lay dead in the pass, while Greek casualties were minimal. Xerxes had thrown a massive force at the Greek position and watched it shatter like waves against a rocky shore. The devastating failure of the first day's assault left Xerxes in a state of frustrated disbelief. This wasn't how wars were supposed to work in his experience. When the Persian Empire wanted something, it took it through overwhelming force and superior numbers. The idea that a handful of Greeks could stand against his entire army was almost incomprehensible. But Xerxes had one more card to play. His personal elite guard, known throughout the ancient world as the Immortals. This was the cream of Persian military might, 10,000 professional warriors drawn from the nobility of the empire. They were called Immortals because whenever one fell in battle or became ill, he was immediately replaced, maintaining the illusion of an invincible, undying unit. These men were better equipped than the regular Persian infantry, wearing scale armour and carrying superior weapons. They had fought in countless campaigns across Asia and had never met their match. Surely, Xerxes reasoned, where his regular troops had failed, the Immortals would succeed. The Immortals attacked with disciplined fury, their reputation and honour on the line. But once again, the narrow confines of the pass neutralised their advantages. No matter how skilled they were individually, they still couldn't break through the Greek shield wall. It was during this second day of fighting that the Greeks employed one of their most effective tactical innovations, the feigned retreat. The phalanx would appear to break and run, tricking the Persians into abandoning their formation for a disorganized pursuit. Then, on signal, the Greeks would suddenly turn, reform their shield wall in seconds, and slaughter the surprised and overextended enemy. This tactic required incredible discipline and timing, exactly the qualities that the Greek phalanx system was designed to develop. The Persians, fighting as individuals rather than as a cohesive unit, fell for it repeatedly. Ancient sources record that Xerxes jumped up from his throne 3 times during the battle, watching in horror as even his most elite troops were cut to pieces. The pass had become a slaughterhouse, filled with the bodies of his finest soldiers, while the Greek line remained essentially unbroken. By the end of the second day, Persian morale was beginning to crack. They had thrown everything they had at this tiny Greek force, and had nothing to show for it but massive casualties. Word began to spread through the Persian camp that the Greeks were supernatural, that they couldn't be defeated by mortal men. For 2 full days, approximately 7,000 Greeks had held off an army of over 100,000. Leonidas' strategy was working perfectly. Every hour the Greeks held the pass was another hour for the rest of Greece to prepare its defences, but unknown to the Greeks their time was running out. As the Greeks rested after their second day of stunning success, a figure emerged from the shadows who would change everything. His name was Ephialtes, a local Greek who knew every path and trail in the mountains around Thermopylae. Driven by the promise of Persian gold, he made his way to Xerxes' camp with information that would seal the fate of the 300 Spartans. Ephialtes revealed the existence of a narrow mountain trail called the Anopia Path. This ancient track wound through the mountains behind the Greek position, allowing a force to bypass the main pass entirely and emerge behind Leonidas's army. For the right price, Ephialtes was willing to guide Persian soldiers along this hidden route. The irony was bitter. The Greeks weren't betrayed by a Persian spy or captured enemy soldier, but by one of their own countrymen, a man whose name would become synonymous with treachery for the next 25 centuries. Xerxes immediately grasped the significance of this intelligence. He ordered his general Hydarnes to take the elite immortals and follow Ephialtes along the mountain path under cover of darkness. If they could get behind the Greek position by dawn, they could attack from both front and rear simultaneously, crushing the defenders in a devastating pincer movement. The Persian force began their treacherous march through the night. The path was narrow and dangerous, winding through steep mountain terrain that would have been challenging even in daylight. But the promise of finally breaking the stalemate drove them forward through the darkness. What Ephialtes and the Persians didn't know was that Leonidas had anticipated exactly this possibility. The Spartan king was too experienced a commander to leave his flanks unguarded. He had stationed 1,000 Phocian soldiers on the mountain to watch the Anopia path and prevent exactly the kind of flanking maneuver the Persians were now attempting. As dawn broke on the third day, the advancing Persians stumbled upon the Phocian guards. The first warning the defenders received was the sound of leaves rustling as the enemy force moved through the underbrush. After a brief exchange of arrows, the Phocians made a catastrophic error in judgment. Assuming they were the primary target of the Persian attack, the Phocian soldiers retreated up the mountain to make what they believed would be their last stand. But the Persians weren't interested in fighting them. They had a much more important objective: getting behind Leonidas and trapping the main Greek force in the pass below. The Persians simply ignored the Phocians and continued down the mountain path. By the time a messenger reached Leonidas with word of the disaster, it was too late. The Persian force was already in position behind the Greek army. The trap was closing, and there was no way out. When the news reached Leonidas that Persian forces were moving to surround his position, he immediately called a council of war. The situation was desperate. With enemies approaching from both front and rear, the Greek army faced certain annihilation if they remained in the pass. Most of the Allied commanders argued for immediate retreat. They had achieved their primary objective, holding the pass for 3 days and inflicting enormous casualties on the Persian army. Now the smart thing to do was withdraw, save the army, and continue the fight elsewhere. Leonidas agreed, for most of the force. He ordered the bulk of the Greek army to retreat immediately while the route was still open. This wasn't surrender or defeat. It was sound military strategy. The delaying action had served its purpose, and preserving these men for future battles was more important than making a futile gesture. But Leonidas himself wasn't going anywhere. For a Spartan king, retreat was unthinkable. He was bound by the warrior code that had shaped his entire life, by the oracle's prophecy, and by his own sense of duty. He and his 300 Spartans would remain in the pass, fighting to the end to cover their allies' escape. The Spartans weren't entirely alone in their final stand. In an act of incredible heroism that often gets overshadowed by the Spartan legend, the entire contingent of 700 soldiers from the city of Thespiae, led by their commander Demophilus, voluntarily chose to stay and die with Leonidas. This wasn't expected of them. They could have retreated with honour, but they made the conscious choice to share the Spartans' fate, knowing full well what it meant. Their sacrifice deserves to be remembered alongside that of the 300. The 400 Thebans also remained, though ancient sources suggest they may have been compelled to stay rather than volunteering, and some apparently surrendered during the final battle rather than fighting to the death. Knowing that the end was near, Leonidas reportedly told his men to eat a hearty breakfast, because that evening they would dine in the underworld. It was a perfectly Spartan response to imminent death, practical, unflinching, and tinged with dark humour. When the final Persian assault began, the Greeks didn't wait behind their defensive wall. Instead, they advanced into the wider part of the pass, determined to kill as many enemies as possible before being overwhelmed. What followed was pure, desperate violence, the kind of close-quarters combat that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The remaining Greeks fought with a fury born of desperation and resolve. Ancient sources describe scenes of almost unimaginable brutality as disciplined warfare devolved into a savage melee. When their long spears shattered, the warriors fought with swords. When their swords broke, they used daggers, rocks, even their bare hands and teeth. Leonidas fell in the heart of the battle, and a vicious fight broke out over his body as both sides struggled to claim the fallen king. The Greeks managed to recover their leader's corpse, but at enormous cost in casualties they could ill afford. Eventually the sheer weight of numbers became insurmountable. The survivors were pushed back to a small hill within the pass, where they made their final stand. Surrounded on all sides with no hope of escape or rescue, they were finally overwhelmed by a storm of Persian arrows. By the battle's end, virtually every Spartan and Thespian lay dead. The hot gates had finally fallen, and the path to southern Greece lay open to Xerxes' army. On the surface, Thermopylae was clearly a Persian victory. The Greek force had been annihilated, the pass was open, and Xerxes' army resumed its march south. In a final act of rage, the Persian king ordered Leonidas's body to be decapitated and crucified, an act considered barbaric even by the brutal standards of ancient warfare. But the cost of this victory was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest the Persians lost somewhere between 20 and 30,000 men, perhaps a quarter of their entire army, in just 3 days of fighting. More importantly, they had lost something that couldn't be easily replaced, the aura of invincibility that had made Persian conquest seem inevitable. The 3-day delay also gave the rest of Greece precious time to prepare for the next phase of the war. While Xerxes was battering himself against the Spartan shield wall, Greek naval forces were maneuvering into position for what would become the decisive battle of the entire war. Just weeks after Thermopylae, the Persian and Greek fleets met in the narrow straits near the island of Salamis. Themistocles, the strategic genius behind the Thermopylae plan, had lured the larger Persian navy into confined waters where their numerical superiority would be neutralized. Exactly the same principle that had been used at the Hot Gates. The result was a devastating Persian defeat. The Greek fleet, fighting in waters they knew well and motivated by the heroism they had witnessed at Thermopylae, completely shattered Persian naval power. Xerxes, watching from a throne on the shore, saw his carefully assembled fleet destroyed in a single day. Without naval support, the massive Persian land army became a logistical nightmare. Cut off from supplies and reinforcements, Xerxes was forced to retreat with most of his forces, leaving only a reduced army to continue the campaign. The following year, at the Battle of Plataea, a unified Greek army inspired by the memory of Leonidas and his men crushed the remaining Persian forces, ending the invasion permanently and establishing Greek independence for generations to come. The true significance of Thermopylae extends far beyond military tactics or strategic outcomes. The battle became a legend almost immediately, transforming from a historical event into a powerful symbol that would resonate through the centuries. For the Greeks, Thermopylae represented something they had never possessed before, a shared identity and common cause that transcended the traditional rivalries between city-states. The sacrifice of the 300 became a rallying cry that helped forge Greek unity and ultimately led to their victory over the Persian Empire. The psychological impact was enormous. Here was proof that the supposedly invincible Persian war machine could be stopped, that ordinary men fighting for their freedom could stand against the greatest empire in the world. The morale boost rippled throughout the Greek world, stiffening resistance and convincing wavering cities to join the fight for independence. In the aftermath of the war, the Greeks erected monuments to commemorate their fallen heroes. A stone lion was carved to honour King Leonidas, and the poet Simonides composed what became one of the most famous epitaphs in history. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. But the story's influence didn't end with ancient Greece. For over 2 millennia, the tale of the 300 has been retold and reinterpreted by countless cultures and generations. It has inspired soldiers facing impossible odds, leaders confronting tyrannical powers, and ordinary people called upon to make extraordinary sacrifices. The battle has been immortalized in poetry, literature, art, and most recently in graphic novels and films that, while taking artistic liberties with historical facts, capture the essential spirit of the story. The idea that some principles are worth dying for, that courage can triumph over overwhelming force, and that a small group of determined people can indeed change the world. What makes Thermopylae truly immortal isn't just the military drama or the heroic sacrifice, but what it represents about human nature and the power of moral courage. The 300 didn't win their battle in any conventional sense, but they achieved something more important. They proved that there are defeats so glorious they become more powerful than victories. The Spartans and their allies knew they were going to die, but they also understood that their sacrifice would serve a greater purpose. They were buying time for their countrymen, demonstrating that Greek freedom was worth any price, and showing the world that tyranny, no matter how powerful, could not break the human spirit. In an age when individual liberty often seems fragile and democracy faces challenges from authoritarian powers, the story of Thermopylae remains remarkably relevant. It reminds us that freedom isn't free, that some things are worth fighting for regardless of the odds, and that ordinary people, when called upon, are capable of extraordinary heroism. The Battle of Thermopylae ended with the annihilation of Leonidas and his brave warriors, but their story was just beginning. In dying at the hot gates, they achieved something more powerful than any military victory. They created a legend that has inspired humanity for over 2,000 years. Their sacrifice wasn't meaningless. It was the spark that ignited Greek resistance, the foundation stone of the victory that would preserve Greek civilization, and, with it, the democratic ideals that would eventually spread throughout the Western world. In a very real sense, we're all inheritors of what those 300 men died for on that narrow strip of land between the mountains and the sea. The lesson of Thermopylae isn't that we should seek glorious deaths or hopeless causes. It's that when everything we value is at stake, when tyranny threatens freedom and darkness threatens light, ordinary people have the power to make extraordinary choices. Sometimes the smallest actions, made by the most unlikely heroes, can echo through eternity and change the course of human history. The story of Thermopylae is just one of countless epic moments that have shaped our world. If you want to explore more legendary battles, heroic last stands, and pivotal moments in human history, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Which historical battle or hero would you like to see us cover next? Let us know in the comments below. Your suggestions help guide our content, and we love hearing from fellow history enthusiasts. Remember to like this video if it gave you a new appreciation for one of history's most legendary battles, and share it with anyone who loves stories of courage against impossible odds. History isn't just about memorizing dates and names. It's about understanding the human drama that has shaped our world and continues to inspire us today. Thank you for joining us on this journey back to the hot gates. And until next time, remember that the echoes of ancient heroism still resonate in our modern world.